we're at an important crossroads now because we know more about how the mind and brain develop than we ever knew before. We're going to learn more in the next 10 and 20 years still. But it gives us an opportunity to redefine the standards of care for infants and children with severe developmental problems, including children with autistic spectrum disorders, but also other problems in relating and communicating. The older model did the best that it could under the circumstances. And the older model worked with surface behaviors, a lot of behavioral work just to modify how children behave, because that was better than ignoring children and better than doing nothing, or better than simply trying to contain their aggressive or withdrawing behavior. And in its time, for a long time, was the only approach available. And the fact that that pioneered intensity for kids was a very, very promising development, because it got people working intensively and got people feeling optimistic about what could be done. But now we can go beyond working on modifying behaviors and work on some of the underlying issues that are giving the children trouble. And we can really now begin to systematize what might be called a developmental approach that synthesizes and integrates all the best information we have about how the mind and brain grow. There are three insights, I think, of the last 20 years that are the cornerstones of our new way of working with infants and children with developmental problems. One of these is the importance of affect, emotions, and relationships for the growth of the brain and the mind. It used to be thought that you want a particular cognitive skill, you stimulate that cognitive skill. Now we know that the brain grows most rapidly in the early years as an outgrowth of interactions with caregivers. So every word in our language has to be lived first to understand it. You don't define an apple by its redness and roundness, you define it by how it tastes and what it feels like to throw it. So language, cognition, math, quantity concepts are all conveyed through interactive relationships, through affects. That's one important new insight. So we can't teach children in the old-fashioned ways anymore, particularly children with special needs who have processing problems. And this means working not only with the relation with the child, but the whole family pattern, because it's within the family context and actually the cultural and community context that these relationships and these emotional interactions occur. So it means a much broader relationship-based, family-based approach, cultural and community approach to children with special needs. The second new insight is that in the last 10 to 20 years, we've also figured out what the important underlying processing capacities are that are behind children's worrisome behavior. So we've understood how children are different, individually different, in the way they process sounds, auditory processing, and language, the way they process what they see, visual spatial process, whether the child can find a hidden object, whether the child can search for an object, whether a child understands that mommy's in the next room and I'm here and doesn't get panicked. Also, motor planning and sequencing. We find enormous variations in children in how they can plan actions. Some children can only do banging, or can only put a car in a garage and take it out. Other children can take the car, put it in the garage, take it to grandmother's house, make a tea party at grandmother's house, and then bring the car back with some extra tea for mommy who's sitting back at the original house. So one child does a one-step, two-step, another child is doing a 6, 7-step planned action pattern. This we call motor planning and sequencing, which is enormously important for children. And we find a lot of the children with autistic spectrum disorders have severe problems with their motor planning and sequencing that underlies a lot of their repetitive behavior. Because if you can't plan and sequence, you're going to repeat. We find that a lot of children who are self-absorbed are underreactive to things like touch and sound. A lot of children who are very avoidant and keep running away from people, it's not because they don't love people, but it's because they're overreactive to things like touch and sound. So we need to look at the sensory modulation of the child to find the right pattern to pull that child into a relationship. So this is the second area of big insight, individual differences in the way the child processes their sensations and plans their motor actions. And this explains a lot of the surface behaviors. But if you work with the underlying processing differences, then you can influence many behaviors and help the child be adaptive across a broad range of issues rather than just work on isolated cognitive skills or isolated behaviors. And the third big area of insight, based on our new research, is to understand what the early stages of development are. Historically, we thought of development in very isolated ways. Motor development. We have a timetable for sitting up, for walking. language development, when the first sounds are made, when the first words are made. For different areas of cognitive development, when a child searches in your hand for an object, when a child can stack blocks in a certain way, and so forth and so on. But each area has been separate. In social and emotional development, when a child will greet, when a child will play with peers, when a child will do some pretending. So we've had separate lines for each area of development, and those, as though these are somewhat independent of one another. But in fact, for the child, all these lines of development are interrelated. The child doesn't separate out their language, their motor skills. He doesn't say, well, I'm a 4-year-old motor-wise, but I'm only a 2-year-old language-wise, and only an 8-month-old social and emotionally. The child integrates all these in one smooth way. In the last 10, 20 years, we've put together that what we call functional developmental roadmap, where we understand now the core levels that synthesize and integrate all the different developmental capacities. And we've identified 6 core levels and then additional ones beyond that help us organize where we want to work with the child. And then we try to identify where the child is, not only in their language or motor development, which we do anyhow, but in their core functional developmental capacities. And then we meet the child where they are and work up the developmental ladder.